Guardians of the Galaxy 3 has casually blasted its way past $500 million in global box office, and fans and critics seem pretty delighted with the movie. Which begs the question, is James Gunn's cosmic trilogy the best miniseries within the MCU? Let's dive in and figure this out. It makes sense to start at the beginning, with the godfather of the MCU. Or, to be more accurate, its problematic absentee dad, Anthony Edward Stark, aka Tony, aka Iron Man. Not only was Iron Man the genesis of the MCU as we know it, but his was the first completed trilogy within the series. And it's pretty solid overall. Everyone likes the first movie. Not many people like the second one, though it has its defenders, and it's got some good stuff in it. And the third movie is divisive, but generally well liked. And that twist that people hate? It's good, actually. Don't at me. So, a strong start and a strong finish with a messy middle.
Yeah, I can fly.
Not the worst trajectory in the world, and Robert Downey Jr. kills it throughout, even with weaker material.
Slow down. You're right.
The big problem, and this will be a recurring issue in these miniseries, is that a lot of Tony's most important moments happen outside of his trilogy. The Avengers is really the climax of his initial character arc, and while Iron Man 3 does an interesting job of exploring his PTSD following the events of the first big team-up,
Are you okay, Mr. Stark?
Take it easy. Tony.
we know that he's going to be appearing in another crossover soon, so there's no real sense of closure by the end of his trilogy. And in fact, Tony's momentous decision to abandon his suits at the end of the trilogy is pretty much immediately undone as soon as Age of Ultron starts. Despite those issues though, the trilogy works. These three movies look good, especially the first two, which were both shot on film. And they each have at least one killer set piece, from Tony's cave escape in Iron Man, to the Monaco showdown in Iron Man 2, and the plane rescue in Iron Man 3. So, solid overall, and frequently great. But is it the best? The jury is still out.
Looks like a TKO to me.
For now, let's move on to our next contender.
Ready?
Yeah.
The Captain America trilogy is the story of a good man who becomes a good man, stays a good man, and ends up being a good man. Yawn, right? Boring. No conflict there, no progression. Surely the worst trilogy? Well, no, because somehow these movies managed to take what could be a boring, cheesy, stiff-ass Boy Scout and turn him into a character that grown adults would lay down their lives for. It's me. I'm the grown adult. Purely in terms of filmmaking, the Captain America trilogy is one of the best within the MCU. It doesn't have a noticeably weaker installment like Iron Man and Thor. The first one is a fun period adventure, and the second and third are arguably two of the best action movies of the last 10 years. And they also give us a pretty coherent character arc for Steve Rogers. Unlike Iron Man, Cap isn't the star of the Avengers movies. He's there and he gets cool stuff to do, but his big turning points tend to happen in his own movies. We see his origin, a genuine hero in a time where it was arguably easier to be a hero. Winter Soldier shows him trying to maintain his principles in a darker, more morally gray time. And Civil War, even though it is kind of an Avengers movie, hinges on the moral conflict between Cap and Iron Man. Of course, like with Iron Man, Cap's trilogy is connected to the wider goings-on in the MCU, but it's thematically and emotionally cohesive in a way that the first trilogy often wasn't. And while it ends on something of a cliffhanger, it's also pretty satisfying. And most importantly, later team-up movies don't undo Cap's progress. So I'm going to say Cap's trilogy is currently edging in front of Ol' Shellhead. And with Civil War being the end of Cap's trilogy and the introduction of a certain web-slinger, that seems like a good point to hand over to our next miniseries, Spider-Man. Everyone loves Spider-Man. Tom Holland is charming, Zendaya is charming, Jacob Batalon is charming. They're all super charming. Michael Keaton's a great villain. Jake Gyllenhaal's a great villain. It was magical seeing all the Spider-Men and their various foes together in No Way Home. And that movie was an absolutely monster hit, one of the MCU's biggest. But does the Spider-Man Home trilogy actually work as a trilogy? I'm gonna play devil's advocate and say, sort of. But also, sort of not. Yeah, that's why they pay me the big bucks. Let's go back to 2016. By the time Spider-Man finally made his way to Marvel for Captain America Civil War, after a bunch of legal maneuvering, we'd had Sam Raimi's iconic trilogy and Mark Webb's slightly less iconic reboot in the space of 15 years. So it was definitely time for a different take. And seeing a younger Spidey trying to make his way within the established continuity of the MCU, interacting with Tony Stark and the others, felt fresh and fun. Plus, it was cool to see the Iron Spider. But the trilogy is, arguably, an elaborate exercise in Peter finding his way back to the point where he started. He does have some personal growth, but by the end of No Way Home, he's an anonymous solo hero trying to help people in New York, like Spider-Man usually is. And what was he when Tony recruited him in Civil War? An anonymous solo hero trying to help people in New York. Just like Spider-Man usually is. And let's not forget that his big climactic decision at the end of Spider-Man Homecoming, where he refuses Tony's offer to join the Avengers,
Last chance, yes or no?
No.
Okay.
is instantly reversed at the beginning of Infinity War. But the movies are charming and fun. And did I mention charming? So I guess it depends how much you can forgive the circular character arc, the resets, and the contradictions. But as judge, jury, and executioner, I'm going to say Spidey falls slightly behind Cap and Iron Man so far. So, who's next? Yeah, I know it's a quartet or a quadrilogy, or whatever you want to call it, but I said miniseries up top, so I think we're covered. The Thor quadrilogy is, let's say, problematic. It's definitely the least consistent of all these miniseries, with a solid first installment, a widely unloved sequel, a pretty universally adored third movie, which is also kind of a soft reboot, and a pretty divisive fourth movie. The biggest issue, and an understandable one when you're building a shared universe like this, is that it took several movies for them to figure out Thor's characterization. If you look at the guy who appears in the first movie, he feels very different from the Thor we know now, or even the Thor who we'd see in the first Avengers team-up. And that's not just because of the weird eyebrows he had in his first movie. Seriously though, they did look weird. The Thor of the first movie is much more self-serious, and even though he gets funnier in Joss Whedon's first Avengers, he still has that grand Shakespearean way of talking. Later movies turn him into a much more overtly comic character, a big lug who loves to fight. And it's a characterization that definitely works, but it does leave his miniseries feeling kind of disjointed. All that being said, you can chart a character progression that makes sense. The arrogant god born to rule, who learns humility, discovers himself, loses everything, then gains a daughter and discovers himself again. It's coherent, just about, even if he takes a pretty convoluted route to get there. After all, there are those two massive Avengers movies which take place between Thor 3 and Thor 4, and he gets a lot to do in those. But for overall consistency, I'm gonna have to put this one bottom of the power rankings so far. Sorry, Odinson fans. Don't take it personally. Looking at Ant-Man's character arc over the course of the MCU, what would you say were his biggest moments? The most meaningful emotional events?
Oh no.
Two pretty important ones, I would say, were him being recruited to help Captain America fight Iron Man, and him waking up 5 years in the future and being reunited with his daughter Cassie, who he discovers is half a decade older. Big, important steps for Scott Lang, right? The thing is, both of those happen in movies that are not Ant-Man movies. Does this matter? In terms of the MCU as an overall 32-movie megastory, not so much. But if we're trying to judge the Ant-Man trilogy, or the Ant-Man and the Wasp trilogy, if you like, it does become a problem. From the start, these movies were intended to be smaller scale. Fitting for a guy who can shrink to the size of a breadcrumb. They were supposed to be lower stakes comic relief, fun disposable romps that would come between the big epic stories. And that's fine. The first two are funny, throwaway adventures. But they suffer from Marvel movies being huge events, regardless of which characters were starring in them. By the time the first Ant-Man was released, the MCU was a juggernaut, and everything they did was a big deal. And they arguably never quite figured out how to fit the Ant-Man movies comfortably into that. And then we get to Quantumania, one of the most divisive MCU movies to date, and one that tries to go big and epic and introduce the franchise's new Thanos. Was Ant-Man the right vehicle for that? Did it fit with the vibe of his movies? And was it wise to introduce your terrifying new villain and then have him defeated by the comic relief? Look, Paul Rudd always brings his A game. He's fun to watch. The shrinking and growing give his movies a visual identity of their own. He's got a great supporting cast. But, like Thor, this miniseries is patchy. And unlike Thor, it doesn't really have a bona fide slam dunk like Ragnarok to lift the average. So, unfortunately, Ant-Man's going on the bottom rung. Hey, at least the Thor stands will be happy, I guess. Finally, we come to the most recent MCU installment and the most recent trilogy to conclude. And, cards on the table, when I asked if this was the best trilogy at the beginning of the video, I was being coy. In my subjective opinion, which of course is based on rigorous logic, math, data, statistics, and otherworldly objective knowledge, it's definitely the best MCU trilogy. But why? Well, the movies surely benefit from having a singular creative voice behind them all, with James Gunn on both writing and directing duties. Gunn has an incredibly distinctive vision. No wonder DC have recruited him to fix their wonky shared universe, and that comes across in these movies. From the sense of humor and the emotional beats to the needle drops and the visual aesthetic, these are James Gunn movies through and through. Within the sometimes homogenous mass of the MCU, the Guardians trilogy stands out as a very personal project, and they're also inarguably the best-looking movies in the series, with the most vibrant cinematography and a bright comic booky color palette. No concrete gray car parks in Atlanta for this miniseries, and being the only properly cosmic miniseries in the MCU, the Guardians movies have mostly been able to stand on their own, without being derailed or contradicted by separate movies. James Gunn has admittedly come out and said that he didn't agree with all the choices made for his characters in Infinity War and Endgame, and you can feel him straining at some of those decisions in Guardians Volume 3. But overall, this trilogy tells its own fun, moving story and tells it well. Also, all 3 movies reliably make me tear up, which I can't say for all the Marvel movies. R.I.P. Guardians of the Galaxy. Long live the Guardians of the Galaxy. Do you have first-hand experience of gruesome cybernetic upgrades? Have you had to deal with a sadistic, ranting father figure who practices eugenics on a galactic scale, and who also killed your best friend, a cute little otter? If, like me, you were deeply affected by the issues raised in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, don't suffer alone. Leave a comment below on this video, and let's cry it out together.